the nitrate going through the ground, and depending on what ground cows are on, the nitrate can move through faster or slower depending on that. And what the fencing does, or actually fencing keeps cows out of a river. There's also a lot of work going on in planting riparian zones, which is another thing to keep cows out of water, so that can keep E. coli and certainly nutrients from animals in water. But if cows are on a paddock and they're putting urine onto soil, it will go through. Hence, there's a lot of research trying to reduce the amount of nitrate in urine so that less is actually going onto the paddock. But,
I think I read Mike Joyce say today it's not the nitrates, it's the algal growth, and we'll have decades of nitrified water catchments.
So the nitrate in the groundwater, which is already coming through and is argued to be still coming through for a very long time, what happens is that it does move, it gets into groundwater, and in the groundwater it gets into surface water, and that contributes to the growth of algae, absolutely, yep.
All right, some good answers. I've just got time for one more, and this is from Julie, who says it's not just farmers. You check every road crossing of a creek or a river, you'll see dumped rubbish and weeds. We need to reclaim our public areas, all of us, and tidy them up and be honest about the effect we all have on the water. There's truth in that too? Oh,
absolutely. I couldn't agree more, and I have to say that I think that the politicisation of farmers through this whole debate is not helping anyone. It's just killing it. We need to have proper discussions and proper, everyone's involved in this. We're all complicit.
All right, thank you.
How depressing, isn't it?
As a fitting conclusion from you, Amanda.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just listening to that going, God, it's like what at this point, at this critical time, how do we change it?
Well, that's what I really like what this crew I was just talking about before, that they want to bring the farmers and the various all the stakeholders together to come up with some kind of solutions. And just hearing that, it did make me worry. But then I thought, actually, even more so, I think it's good that these guys are doing this. And here we are as a country, can put bikes on boats and beat billionaires in America's Cups. And I would like to think we could pull something off here together.
You're
bikes on
damn
boats
right.
beating billionaires. I like that.
You're damn right. Yeah.
Dr. Ronald Duncan, thank you. Before we go, Dunedin man's in the news. Incensed by the amount of broken glass on Dunedin cycleways. This is Murray Wallace. He started carrying a brush and shovel with him when he goes out on his bike. He seems to spend as much time off his bike as on it, sweeping up broken glass all over the city. It's not just the student area, he says. Other cyclists agree it's a significant issue. Spokes Dunedin's looking at gathering its members to sweep the cycleways by hand.
Only in Dunedin, I say. The fact that it became such a story, I think. That's right.
Don't you and I remember
I know it's serious.
Do we remember a different Dunedin, or do I look back through broken glasses here?
Oh, Jim. I don't know. Perhaps we weren't looking down enough, Jim. Perhaps we were just looking up, the wondrous things that were around us in Dunedin back then. I don't know. I don't remember anything like that, but having said that, I do. My son was at university in Dunedin a few years ago, and I was staying down there, and I went for a run or a walk, whatever, one morning, and I think it was in the weekend, and I did notice there was an amazing amount of litter and glass, and it was actually pretty damn depressing.
Not much time for a conclusion from you, Dwayne, but feel free.
Oh, well, in Canterbury, I don't think it's too bad, but then I went to France and there was so much dog droppings.
Oh yes,
and I thought to myself,
too.
Which is worse, glass or dog droppings?
The dog droppings of France. Dwayne Major, thank you very much for being on today.
Oh, it's been a pleasure.
And Amanda Miller, you too.
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks,
you, Dwayne.
everybody. That's us back tomorrow. John Campbell with Checkpoint.
Kia ora everyone. Tonight, Hurricane Irma and the destruction it is leaving in its wake as it passes through the Caribbean. We'll have the latest from the Caribbean. We're going to Florida, where it's expected to arrive over the weekend, and we'll be live in Puerto Rico. A man who killed his 2-year-old daughter by accidentally shooting her in the head is sentenced to 4 years in prison. Ka Tempa found guilty of repeated rape. The New Zealand Rugby Union reveals it's investigated 36 cases of misconduct in the past 4 years. As part of its respect and responsibility reviews, Chief Executive Steve Chew is with us. The Electoral Commission investigates a Maori Party candidate. Cantabrians welcome a much-awaited new shopping and dining district, and fashion retailer Topshop goes into receivership.
RNZ News at 5. Maloa Lele, good afternoon. Ko Katrina Batinaho. It can now be revealed that the prisoner who raped 3 of his cellmates was serving a sentence of preventive detention for rape at the time. William Katipa was today found guilty of 14 charges, including sexual violation and threatening to kill, following a trial in the High Court in Auckland. Edward Gay reports.
Katipa raped a young mother in front of her 2-year-old daughter in the 1990s. The crime went unsolved at the time, but when he raped a 13-year-old girl 8 years later, a DNA sample linked him to it. He was sentenced in 2005 to preventive detention with a minimum non-parole period of 10 years. Despite being a convicted rapist, Katipa was double-bunked with other prisoners, 3 of whom he raped. He'll be sentenced in November. I Tamaki Makoto ko Edward Gaiaho.
Dozens of jobs are potentially at risk with today's announcement that the fashion retailer Topshop has gone into receivership. Top Retail employs about 70 people in its Auckland and Wellington Topshop and Topman stores. The franchise, controlled by a British company of the same name, opened less than 2 years ago in this country. The directors say they looked at every way of keeping the business going, but competition was too tough. The receivers, McGrath Nichols, says the shops will stay open for the time being while it looks at the options. The Australian Topshop operation collapsed 4 months ago, owing close to $40 million. The Maori Party president, Tukuroirangi Morgan, is blaming a volunteer for sending messages offering virtual money to potential supporters. The Electoral Commission says it's received several complaints about sums of money known as hongbao dollars being offered on the Chinese social media message app WeChat in exchange for support of the party's botany candidate, Witex Kang. Mr Morgan says Mr Kang has done nothing wrong.
It is baseless, there is no grounds for it, and I stand by my man. And I'm happy to provide every scrap of information that is before the Electoral Commission. We have nothing to hide on this matter.
The Māori Party president, Tukuroirangi Morgan. Hurricane Irma has caused devastation across the Caribbean, and the tiny island of Barbuda has been rendered, in the words of its Prime Minister, barely habitable. Gaston Brown says at least 1 person there has been killed. 6 people also died in the French territory of St Martin. The force of the hurricane seems to have abated slightly as it reached Puerto Rico on its way towards Florida via Haiti and the Dominican Republic. In Australia, the High Court has dismissed a challenge to the government's plans for a voluntary postal survey on same-sex marriage. 2 groups challenged the plan as unconstitutional, taking particular aim at the way the survey would be funded. The challenge was focused on the $120 million set aside to be drawn from a fund available for urgent and unforeseen matters. That fund can be used without parliamentary approval. Survey letters are due to be sent out to Australian households next week. A judge has sent a man to prison for shooting and killing his 2-year-old daughter, saying he needed to fully accept responsibility for her death. Gustav Otto Sampt was sentenced in the High Court in Auckland today to 4 years and 4 months in prison for the manslaughter of Amokura Daniel Sampt. He fatally shot her at their Mangere home in June last year. In an emotional plea for mercy today, his partner, Julia Daniels, says Sampt punished himself every day for what happened. But Justice Venning said because Sampt continued to deny he pulled the trigger, it would not be possible for him to go home with his family.
Your denial that you pulled the trigger is something that you have latched onto after the event to explain, perhaps to yourself and to others, the terrible consequences of your actions that morning.
Justice Venning in the High Court today. 9 Greenpeace protesters have been arrested for trespassing at an irrigation dam west of Christchurch. Early this morning, they occupied the inside of the dam, which is yet to be filled with water, and set up a makeshift camp. After an 8-hour standoff, the police moved in and arrested them. Greenpeace says it had no choice but to take the action after the dam's owner, Central Plains Water, threatened it with a court injunction aimed at shutting down a peaceful protest it had planned. It says it wants to raise awareness of what it says is widespread public opposition to irrigation schemes on the Canterbury Plains. It's 5:04. Sport, and the Silver Ferns are bent on restoring their dominance over England when the two sides meet in the opening match of a 3-test series in Wellington tonight. England upset New Zealand 59-54 in the recent Quad Series tournament, and coach Janine Southby has brought in 4 new players for this series.
We want players to take risks, because that's how you've got to have courage out there, but you've got to make sure you don't keep making the same mistake over and over and over again. So, my mantra is you have a go, if it doesn't work, learn from it and don't do it again.
Janine Southby. Roger Federer's quest for a 5th US Tennis Open title is over. Argentina's Juan Martín del Potro beat him in 4 sets in today's quarter-final. Del Potro, who won the tournament in 2009, will play top seed Rafael Nadal in the semis. And for the first time since 1981, it'll be an All-American Women's Final Four at the Open. 15th seed Madison Keys will play 20th seed Coco Vandeweghe in the one semi, and 9th seed Venus Williams meets unseeded Sloane Stephens in the other. The Pumas are counting on fresh faces to revive a sluggish start to the Rugby Championship and end a dire record against the All Blacks in New Zealand. Following 2 straight losses to South Africa, coach Daniel Aukade has made 7 starting changes for the match in New Plymouth on Saturday night. That's the news.
Dodgy petrol pricing.
Hurricane Harvey had an effect on it, but I actually think it's a little more serious than that and more cynical.
Finance spokesman at War.
You threw this on the table to try to get the reaction that you got.
A feisty debate.
Well, of course, you're the interviewer. That's your job.
Well, there's, at some points in this interview I am. Although you guys are
if you want to go and get a coffee going, we'll just carry on.
Right.
Perfect with your morning cuppa. Guy and Espiner and Susie Ferguson. Morning Report, weekdays from 6.
Then on 9 to noon, Professor of Societal Psychology Darren Hodgetts on New Zealand's precariat class, people who have uncertain, insecure and unequal lives. And after 10, the internationally acclaimed psychologist Dr. Edith Eger, one of the last remaining Holocaust survivors, whose life's mission's been to free her patients from the prisons of their own minds. Join me, Catherine Ryan, on 9 to noon after Morning Report on RNZ National.
Met surface weather through to midnight tomorrow. Northland, Auckland, Coromandel and Bay of Plenty, occasional showers, some heavy. Western areas from Waikato to Kapiti, including the central high country, periods of rain or showers with a few squally thunderstorms in the west today. Gisborne, Hawke's Bay, Wairarapa, Wellington, Marlborough and Nelson, rain about the ranges and a few showers elsewhere. Westerly gales in exposed parts of Hawke's Bay and Wairarapa. Bulla, Westland and Fiordland, also Canterbury High Country, periods of rain, sometimes heavy with thunderstorms and hail. Snow down to 500 metres at times, but lowering to 200 metres in Fiordland tomorrow night. For the remainder of Canterbury, also Otago and Southland, scattered showers mainly about Otago and Southland, but a few spreading to Canterbury at times, possible thunderstorms in the east today. And the Chatham Islands, rain easing to showers this evening, thunderstorms possible tomorrow morning. It is exactly 5:08, and you're listening to Checkpoint.
Thanks, Katrina. Coming up tonight, the Greens on pay equity. WeChat enters the election campaign. A Colmar-Brunton poll out after 6, and that famous question from Forskin's Lament, what are you? New Zealand Rugby asks it of itself. Much more tonight too. But first, at least 7 people are now confirmed dead as Hurricane Irma sweeps through the Caribbean, leaving immense destruction. The Category 5 storm brought winds of up to 300 km an hour, wreaking havoc in the areas it's passing most directly over. Irma started in deeper water and way further out to sea than most tropical cyclones. Later, we'll consider what that means. But first, Bridget Burke on Barbuda's Prime Minister describing the island as barely habitable and warning of a possible mass evacuation as another hurricane follows Irma's tail.
Hurricane Irma, a massive Category 5 storm, making landfall in the Caribbean, packing winds of almost 300 kilometres an hour. Amateur video showed Irma battering the French island of Saint-Martin with boats and debris piled up along the coastline. And footage from a fixed beach camera on the island shows torrential rain and violent winds unleashed by Irma, one of the most powerful Atlantic storms in a century. Aerial footage shows what's left of the tiny island of Barbuda. Prime Minister Gaston Brown, who visited hours after Irma had passed, said at least 90% of structures have been destroyed and the island is now barely habitable. He warned the island's entire population of 1,700 may have to be evacuated with another hurricane, Jose, following closely behind Irma.
Some properties have been totally demolished. It is absolutely heart-wrenching. I mean, the infrastructure, the utilities infrastructure was damaged. The physical infrastructure was damaged. You'd recognize, too, that the island is literally under what? You know that we are threatened now potentially by yet another storm, Hurricane Jose. And if that is the case and it's coming our way, then clearly we will have to evacuate the residents of Barbuda.
Mr Brown warned a mass evacuation of the island could begin within the next 12 hours. After wreaking havoc in Barbuda, the storm began lashing Puerto Rico, where WSMV reporter Carly Gordon is holidaying.
Leading up to the storm, it was really scary for me personally because every time you ask a local, are you afraid, and you're looking for some sort of comfort, in their response, they say, yes, we're afraid. The last hurricane they remember was 1998. It was a Category 3 or 4, and they lost power for a really long time, had to evacuate. You know, I think that long after we are off this island, they could possibly be without electricity for months at a time. Just really could devastate this place. At our hotel, the staff, they're only, you know, a handful that stay behind, but we talked to one young lady who she chose to stay here and work because she knew it was going to be more dangerous in her apartment. So, yeah, it's really sad and scary at this point.
In Florida, residents stocking up on food, water and other essentials. Florida Governor Rick Scott warning that Irma could be even worse than Hurricane Andrew, which devastated the state in 1992.
Remember, we can rebuild your home, but we cannot rebuild your life.
Authorities in the state are not taking chances, ordering a mandatory evacuation in the Florida Keys.
We could be looking at wave heights that would literally put the ocean over the islands. We've got to remember we're an island community and islands go underwater.
It's going to be crazy getting out here. It's going to be gridlocked. Getting out of the Keys, there's only one way in and one way out.
Residents of low-lying areas in densely populated Miami-Dade County were also urged to move to higher ground.
I'm scared. Category 5, never been through one, been through a 4, but never a 5, and I don't want to be here.
US President Donald Trump is closely monitoring the storm. The White House approved emergency declarations for Florida, Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands, mobilizing federal disaster relief efforts. Irma is expected to become the second powerful storm to thrash the US mainland in a matter of weeks, with Harvey killing more than 60 people and causing as much as $240 billion in damage after hitting Texas. For Checkpoint, Bridget Burke.
We're going to risk the phone lines and go now live to CNN's George Howell in Puerto Rico's capital, San Juan. George, thank you so much for joining us. We're very grateful for your time, particularly in the circumstances you find yourself. What's going on now? Has the storm passed?
John, good to be with you. So the storm has moved on now to the west of this U.S. territory. The good news here, many people thankful for the fact that this storm remained just about 50 miles to the north of San Juan of Puerto Rico, but we certainly experienced a great deal of the strength of Hurricane Irma. We felt the strong winds that came through, gusts of anywhere from 60 to 100 miles per hour here in the United States. Also, the winds, not only the story, the swell of the ocean. We were expecting a great deal of flooding from that as well. A lot of this damage can only be assessed by the light of day, but many people here breathing a sigh of relief, given that the storm dodged us.
Yeah, that's very, very good news. Puerto Rico is blighted by debt, right? So serious infrastructure damage. They simply, basically don't have the money to rebuild there, do they?
That's true. You point out the backdrop of this storm coming at a time when this island territory is dealing with $70 billion in debt, a great deal of debt. The cost of goods went up dramatically back in 2015. It's left many people a great deal of difficulty just paying for everyday things, everyday items. So there is a concern among locals here about what recovery looks like if damage is, again, very extensive. We do understand that this U.S. territory will receive federal aid, disaster aid from the United States government. But again, it can only be determined by light of day how much damage was there from this storm. We do know that at least 70% of power customers. 70% are out of power, some 1 million people without power on this island. And according to the governor, he believes that damage is extensive. All of this soon to be determined.
George Howell joining us live from Puerto Rico's capital, San Juan. Thank you so much, George. So something of a near miss for Puerto Rico. They won't know until it's daylight. It may head now, Irma, towards Florida. We will go there later, and we will also look at the fact that Irma started in much deeper waters, way further out to sea than most tropical cyclones. What does that mean? All of that coming up on Checkpoint. Respect and Responsibility. That was the title of New Zealand Rugby's review into the sport's broader culture, and more specifically also into 36 cases of misconduct investigated during the past 4 years. Those incidents included drunk behaviour and associated damage, inappropriate sexual behaviour towards others, violent behaviour towards others, instances involving alcohol and drugs, and a homophobic slur overheard by a member of the public. New Zealand Rugby says it's determined to address the specifics and the broader flaws in the culture of our national sport. I spoke to CEO Steve Tew a short time ago, and he said they wanted to do better. But with 150,000 people playing rugby in New Zealand and many more former players associated with rugby clubs, how do you do that? And where do you start? I asked Steve Tew for specifics.
A real emphasis on getting to our players at an earlier age. So we're seeing our young boys in particular playing first 15 rugby, effectively being told that they're elite, high-performance athletes at a ridiculously young age, frankly, and therefore developing, I think, under the pressure of that expectation, a sense of entitlement and some of the issues that stardom brings with it without yet being emotionally and mentally ready for it. So there's a job to be done getting some of our education programs in particular down to a younger group. There's work to be done around the way we use alcohol, and I think that's something that we've embraced with our brewery partners anyway. We want to be leading the discussion around the moderate use and sensible use of alcohol as opposed to prohibition.
How is that meaningful? I'm sorry to interrupt, but if we look at the 36 cases of serious misconduct that were looked at, 33 incidents involving players, 2 involving a team and 1 involving a club, and then we go down to the description that in more than half of the situations, alcohol played a key factor. Then we go to 11.2, implementation, separate rugby performance from alcohol. You have Peter Keane, a long-serving lineman on your board. You are sponsored by Lions. Steinlager is a team brand. How do you get that balancing act right?
Yeah, well, I mean, those statistics are not surprising, are they? If you went to any court list or any summary of convictions, particularly involving young people, you would see alcohol as a contributing factor. It's an inherent part of our society. It has been a part of New Zealand culture, I guess, for as long as we've been here. And we know that prohibition won't work, so we've got an opportunity with Lion, in our case, and DB for some of our provinces and super teams, to try and get the A, education in place, and B, get the messaging across.
What does that mean, though, Steve? What does that mean? Boy, it sounds good, but actually, when you step back and say, OK, in real terms, what are you going to do that will be different? What is it?
OK, so what it means, if you want, I mean, what we can do around our own environment is obviously make sure that the education is very thorough. But in terms of getting it down into the community level, we're going to have to encourage clubs to take an approach to alcohol that is reflective of good, responsible hosting. So food, a range of alcoholic and non-alcoholic beverages, closing times at a reasonable hour. Don't punish people with binge drinking. Don't over-celebrate with alcohol. They're the messages we got through the review, and they're very common messages throughout this drinking issue in New Zealand.
Your chairman, Brent Impey, and I know that the CEO never speaks on the chairman's behalf, so I understand that. So New Zealand Rugby is ready for what's ahead. I'm just surprised that this is ahead. I mean, if we look at the sort of things that are being addressed here, you know, misogyny, sexism, homophobia, you know, not getting on the piss and behaving like a dick, all of those things aren't ahead, are they? They are issues we should have been grappling with for a very long time, particularly in our national sport.
Yeah, and we have. And I think that's the thing I guess I'm most comforted by in terms of the work the panel has done. They have literally had every single piece of information they could possibly want and ask for, and they've come back and said, look, you are already doing a lot of things well. You know, we're the first sports organisation in New Zealand to get a rainbow tick. We've led sports' response to that appalling review of how people with different sexual orientations felt about being comfortable in a sporting environment. We've established that Head First campaign, which is a sort of a groundbreaking approach to talking about mental illness, and isn't that a topical issue for New Zealand right now? So, look, we can do things better, but we've already started on a lot of the stuff, John, and we work really hard. But ultimately, we have a lot of people involved in our game. Not everyone is perfect, and we will not get everything right all the time. We have to accept that there will be issues, and we have to deal with that.
Do you have to try harder at the top? I'm looking at the board. I've got the photos in front of me. And, you know, this is a bit rich coming from me, but there are 9 people on the board. 8 of them are white men over the age of 40. Mea culpa, so am I. You have 1 woman and 1 Maori, and somewhat conveniently, they're the same person. I mean, really? Is New Zealand rugby trying hard enough?
Well, I mean, there's obviously an element of critique there that's fair, isn't there? But we've got a constitution that appoints our board. We've worked very hard, particularly over the last 2 years, to amend that constitution. There's another, hopefully, iteration of that coming very soon, which will give us a much better opportunity to bring diversity to the table. But I mean, this is not meant to be cynical or defensive, but we chuckled today. The room was largely full of white male reporters.
Yeah, truly. What is rugby's responsibility? Now, you're on national radio, as you know, and there are people who are listening who don't like rugby at all, but it is our national sport. It is the most watched sport on New Zealand television. It is the most attended sport in terms of tickets that you purchase and sometimes pay a lot of money for. It is the sport that dominates media coverage, that is more often than not at the top of the sports pages and newspapers and at the front of the sports news on radio and television. What responsibility do you have to be social leaders?
Well, I think it is a responsibility, but for us, it's always been an opportunity. I mean, we've not, we're not undersold ourselves, have we? We have said our vision is to inspire and unify the country, and from time to time, we truly achieve that very lofty vision. But there are times when, inside our game, we have some things happen that are less than what we would want them to be, and we're going to work very hard to have fewer of those by making sure everybody in our game has the right tools and frameworks around them to make that the case. But as I said, John, it's an opportunity for us to lead some change, real cultural change in New Zealand, but it will be very hard work and we won't get it right all the time.
Steve Tew talking to me a short time ago, you would have heard him mention, probably very correctly, that it was mostly white male reporters at today's media conference as they announced their review. Well, our reporter Rowan Quinn, who is very much a female, was sitting in the front row. We will have her report on events after 6 o'clock tonight. Rowan filing for Checkpoint on that review. An emotional plea for mercy from the partner of an Auckland man who shot and killed his 2-year-old daughter could not save him from prison. Gustav Otto Svant was sentenced at the High Court in Auckland today to 4 years and 4 months in prison for the toddler's manslaughter and 3 months to be served concurrently for illegal possession of firearms. This tragedy unfolded on June the 2nd last year at the family property in Favona Road. Mangere, little Amakora Daniels Svant died instantly that day from a single shot fired by her father from a shotgun he said or thought didn't work. Joanna McKenzie reports.
Sam's partner, Julia Daniels, struggled to speak at times as she read out her victim impact statement to the court.
Having her life cut short at the hands of her daddy is an unforgettable day. A stupid, reckless accident has affected our family but also made us stronger.
She said Amakura had been their angel and Sam's pride and joy, his little queen. She told the court he already punishes himself every day for what happened.
I know this is a painful situation for Gustav and me. This type of pain, you can't wipe it away. Gustav has to live with this guilt for the rest of his life.
Miss Daniels' father, Piripi Daniels, also gave a statement saying how the shooting had changed their lives forever. He said Amakura was their taonga and the days following her death were laden with grief, but they found some solace at the toddler's funeral.
Gustav attended the tangihanga. We had no problem with that as far as we were concerned. The event was very tragic, but our love for Amakura, Julia, and subsequently Gustav superseded it.
Julia Daniels also pleaded for mercy from the court for Sam, saying his children needed him at home.
All I can ask for is have mercy on Gustav. He knows he has done wrong, but he also knows that there's a long road ahead of us and we can do this together as a family. Our babies need their daddy. At home, that's where he belongs. not behind bars. This way we can heal together. Because of the court and his curfews, we haven't had the time to actually mourn the loss of our baby.
But Justice Venning said a non-custodial sentence would not be possible because he didn't believe Samph was truly remorseful.
Your denial that you pulled the trigger is something that you have latched onto after the event to explain, perhaps to yourself and to others, the terrible consequences of your actions that morning.
Justice Venning said while the family had forgiven him, Samph still needed to fully accept responsibility for Amakura's death.
That support in some ways bolsters your view that in a way you are a victim and may make it difficult for you to take responsibility for the consequences of your actions.
As Samph was taken from court, his partner and family called out to him, telling him they loved him. In Auckland for Checkpoint, called Joanna Mackenzie-Aho.
5:25. We're going to go live now to Laura Tupou, our reporter at the High Court in Auckland, where Gareth Morgan, the leader of the Opportunities Party, of course, has been arguing that his party should have the right, should be included in TVNZ's multi-party debate tomorrow evening and its youth debate next week. Laura, are you there?
Hello.
Hello, Laura. It's John. You're live on air. What's the decision? I believe there is one.
Yes, the decision's just come out. So the judge has ruled that there won't be a judicial review. Gareth Morgan's application has been declined.
Right. So in short, TVNZ don't have to have him.
No, he will not be at the multi-party debate tomorrow night, nor will he be involved in the youth debates next week. So those are the two main debates that he was talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Is he there? Was he there as this was announced?
No, apparently he's in Tauranga, but his head of communications, Sean Plunkett, was present.
And was there a reaction from him, or is this all just unfolding now?
This is all just unfolding. People are still walking out of the courtroom.
Thanks, Laura. First for the news on Checkpoint, Laura Tupou. So Gareth Morgan went to the High Court to really try and crowbar, well, judicially, into the TVNZ debate. A real disagreement around this. Should a leader outside of Parliament, who is polling, 2 or 3%, somewhere in that range, be allowed in a multi-party debate? Views vary wildly and widely. The High Court said they cannot basically compel TVNZ to take him. 5:27. The Maori Party is blaming a volunteer for sending messages offering virtual money to potential supporters, but is adamant its candidate is not at fault. The Electoral Commission is investigating the party's first Asian candidate, Wetex Khan, amid allegations his campaign offered those cash credits to people receiving the messages on the Chinese social media app WeChat. Huge numbers of people on WeChat. The party's president, Rohingya Morgan, says Mr Khan has done nothing wrong and insists it's all part of a smear campaign against his party. Anusha Bradley reports.
Mr Kang was staying silent on the matter today, but his party's president, Rohingya Morgan, called a news conference this afternoon to answer the allegations. He says Mr Kang did not send the messages, but admits they were sent by a volunteer in his campaign and 2 independent supporters.
I've gone through every post. I've been fully briefed, and I am very confident that our candidate will stand up to the rigorous investigation that will be carried out by the Electoral Commission.
Mr Morgan says the Electoral Commission was alerted by Bevan Schwang after she was refused a job on Wetex Kang's campaign.
This is a smear campaign on the Maori Party. This is a baseless attack on the Maori Party.
Bevan Schwang, whose affair with former Auckland Mayor Len Brown led to him not seeking another term, denies she was targeting Mr Kang.
I have a friend who sent me the screenshots because she was concerned about what's happening in the WeChat group. So what I've done is to send this to the Electoral Commission and ask if this is okay. As I understand from the Electoral Commission that there were more than one person who've made similar inquiries.
Are there any political motives here?
No. I'm not campaigning for anybody or running anything, and therefore, no, there is no reason for me to target Mr. Kang.
The Electoral Commission confirms it has received several complaints about the use of WeChat associated with the Maori Party and one complaint about another political party. A specialist in electoral law, Graham Edgeler, says the law is quite clear.
The Electoral Act makes it a criminal offence for anyone, including a candidate or someone on their behalf, to bribe a voter. And that includes giving them money or gifts or things that are worth money. In order to vote for them or in order to stop them voting at all, or even forbids you from paying someone, hey, I'll give you $5 if you vote and I don't care who you vote for.
The Maori Party says 1,847 people received the messages on WeChat, but the total amount attached to them was just $27. That's just over 1 cent each. WeChat credits are based on the Chinese system of hongbao, or red envelope, where money is given to family and friends as a gift. The credits can be used to purchase items or be credited to a person's Chinese bank account once a certain amount is reached. A Chinese social media PhD student at Massey University, Louis Liu, says it's a cultural practice to give red envelopes in WeChat conversations to encourage people to participate in discussions. The Maori Party likens the cultural practice to giving a koha to a marae. Graham Edgeler says the gifting of WeChat credits during an election campaign, even if it's a cultural practice, may still flout the law.
A politician might go to a marae and take a koha, and so certainly things like that can come into it and aren't corrupt. But if it's very much about the so you'll vote for me, then I don't think a cultural thing would resolve that.
The Maori Party says it will release all the information it's given to the Electoral Commission for its investigation, but would not say when it would do this. For Checkpoint, Anusha Bradley.
I'll sing it. I'll just hum the theme, Rangi. We all know it anyway. Yeah. Thanks very much, Katrina.
Go.
Thanks, Katrina. That was lovely. Coming up, the Green Party calls for businesses to include genders and payroll reporting because women can sing and do their job at the same time. Cantabrians welcome a much-awaited new shopping and dining district, and fashion retailer Topshop New Zealand goes into receivership. Why? But first, here is the multi-talented Katrina Batten with the headlines.
Would have been better with my mic on, of course. It can now be revealed that the prisoner who raped 3 of his cellmates was serving a sentence of preventive detention for rape at the time. William Katipa was today found guilty of 14 charges, including sexual violation and threatening to kill, following a trial in the High Court in Auckland. Katipa raped a young mother in front of her 2-year-old daughter in the 1990s and a 13-year-old girl 8 years later. Dozens of jobs are potentially at risk with today's announcement that the fashion retailer Topshop has gone into receivership. Top Retail employs about 70 people in its Auckland and Wellington Topshop and Topman stores. An Auckland man who fatally shot his 2-year-old daughter has been sentenced to more than 4 years in prison. Gustav Otto Sampt was earlier found guilty of the toddler's manslaughter. The Maori Party president, Tukuorangi Morgan, is blaming a volunteer for sending messages offering virtual money to potential supporters. The Electoral Commission has received several complaints about sums of money known as hongbao dollars being offered on the Chinese social media message app WeChat in exchange for support of the party's botany candidate Witex Kang. The High Court in Auckland has declined the Opportunity Party's bid to be part of TVNZ's debate tomorrow evening and its youth debate next week. TOP's lawyer Francis Cook QC had argued TOP's inclusion in the debates was critical to the election process and TVNZ's criteria should be more robust. A new report reveals the Rugby Union has investigated 36 cases of serious misconduct or misconduct in the past 4 years. They include inappropriate sexual behaviour, violent behaviour to team members or coaches, drug and alcohol offences and homophobic slurs. In Australia, the High Court has dismissed a challenge to the government's plans for a voluntary postal survey on same-sex marriage. Survey letters are due to be sent out next week. And snow on the Lewis Pass means the alternative highway between Picton and Christchurch will remain closed overnight for safety reasons. The Transport Agency says trees are buckling under the weight of the snow and it's also making the edges of the road dangerous. Those are the headlines. I'm back at 6.
John Mitchell, our business reporter, standing by to join us in a moment. But before that, the Green Party wants businesses to have to include genders and payroll reporting so it's more transparent whether women are being paid the same or less than men doing the same job. The policy was announced this morning by Leader James Shaw and Women's spokesperson Jan Logie. Jacob McSweeney reports.
So Kate Shepherd Place, of course, named for the most badass suffragette in New Zealand history, is just up around the corner.
The Greens leader James Shaw and Women's spokesperson Jan Logie made the announcement in Wellington today, surrounded by feminists, young and old. James Shaw says the numbers around pay equity in this country are irrefutably bad.
Female chartered accountants will earn $45,000 a year less. Female engineers earn 18.8% less than male engineers. Even in female-dominated occupations like nursing or midwifery, women earn on average 7% less than men.
Mr Shaw then passed the microphone over to Jan Logie, who he referred to as the next Minister for Women. She says the Greens would change the Employment Relations Act so employers have to include gender in payroll reporting, allowing women to see where they may be paid less than men doing the same job.
This is providing a signal for somebody to see if there's a problem in their workplace, and they can then use that information to be able to have the discussion with their employer, and then their employer will be required to prove that they are not discriminating on the basis of gender.
The Greens would also put the responsibility on public sector chief executives to achieve equal pay for their staff. Mr Shaw says there would be consequences for those who fail. Labour's Jacinda Ardern says fair pay for women should be a priority for any government, but her party's focus is on making it easier to get pay equity claims across the line.
Our policy has been focused primarily, though, on making sure that we get the legislation right so that there's a framework for pursuing pay equity claims that doesn't set the barriers too high, and that's been our big focus.
RNZ has asked several of New Zealand's biggest employers if they would be happy to give out general gender information when reporting payroll. Air New Zealand says this year it will, for the first time, include gender pay reporting in its sustainability report. The airline says its gender pay gap is at 0.4%, the difference stemming from differences in tenure and experience. Progressive, which owns Countdown Supermarkets, says it is committed to having no salary wage gap between men and women employees in the same positions. And a spokesperson at ANZ Bank, which has done a lot of work in eliminating the pay gap between men and women, says it supports any ideas that eliminate disparity elsewhere. People in Wellington welcomed more equal pay, but many of them quickly picked holes in the policy.
There's more talk than action at the moment, so it would be great if a party does impose those kind of things.
It's not only about pay, right? Because also you need to take into account experience, and not everybody has the same, would necessarily have the same pay, regardless of gender.
Is it anyone else's business what gender you are? My son told me that Facebook now lists 96 options. Who's to say male and female are the only options that people identify with?
It is pretty tricky. I mean, I guess that's for someone else to sort out how you can do it, what you can do it. But the more transparency, the better.
Doing that will make it a lot clearer, a lot more upfront. So it's an open book for everyone.
The Greens would also double funding for the Ministry for Women to $10 million and fund an expert body to help push through pay equity claims. Mō te otaka o te ahi, ko Jacob McSweeney aho.
Let's go to business news now with Jonathan Mitchell joining us from Wellington. Jonathan, Top Shop. The receivers have been called in. What's gone on here?
Evening, John. Yes, there was a lot of fanfare and optimism when the company launched here in New Zealand a couple of years ago, backed by some big names, Karen Walker and Barkers, some long-standing players in this market, but essentially the crux of today's competition, including from big names H&M, is really something the whole industry is grappling with. Thin margins, high rents in those prime sites, Auckland and Wellington, but much bigger than that. Analysts say Topshop's clothing lines really failed to win over customers. A lot of it was stock that couldn't be sold in Britain and North America. Very telling, perhaps. Directors say they're disappointed. They looked at all options on the table to keep it going. McGrath Nicol has been appointed as the receiver, so the shops will stay open for the time being. You'll remember possibly that the Australian chain with the same name failed earlier this year, owing about $40 million. But as a whole, there could be a future here in New Zealand. The parent company in Britain could take over the local shops. But really, this is just the latest. It follows the failure of David Lawrence and Marks last year. There was Pumpkin Patch as well.
Yeah. Tough business retailing clothes, possibly less tough retailing or selling chickens, right? How's Teagle going, Jono?
Well, they held their annual meeting today. They've got some reason to smile. A rising population. They're expecting their underlying profit to beat last year's $75.6 million. So sales are strong. There's certainly an appetite for chicken. They've rebranded. They're expanding their product lines. They are putting a bit of a focus on free range as well. That's something moving forward for them, as well as their export markets, especially into new markets.
Thanks, Johnny. What happened on the markets today?
Top 50 index gained 14 points, sits at just over 7,800, and that Kiwi dollar hovering around 72 US cents, 90 Australian.
Jonathan Mitchell with Business News, thank you so much. The prisoner who raped 3 of his cellmates was serving a sentence of preventive detention for 2 rapes at the time. William Katipa faced a 9-day trial at the High Court in Auckland, where today the jurors returned with their guilty verdicts after deliberating over 3 days. Katipa was serving a sentence of preventive detention when he carried out the separate attacks on 3 younger prisoners during lockdown. Our court reporter Edward Gay was in court when the verdicts came in and told me that while the jury knew Katipa was serving preventive detention, they didn't know what for.
Yeah, that's right. And in his summing up to the jurors earlier this week, Justice Downs told the jurors the reason Katipa is serving preventive detention was utterly irrelevant to their task. He told them not to speculate on what that was, and if they did, that could result in a mistrial. Since the guilty verdicts have come down, we can now report that, according to court documents that RNZ's seen, in 1994, Katipa broke into the home of a 19-year-old woman and raped her in front of her 2-year-old daughter, and that crime actually went unsolved for 8 years. 8 years later, when shortly after being released from prison for burglary, Katipa raped a 13-year-old girl, and when he was arrested, the police took a DNA sample from him, and they were able then to link him back to that earlier rape. He pleaded guilty, but not until the morning of that trial that the witness was ready to give evidence. She was in court. He was sentenced in 2005 to preventive detention, and that had a minimum non-parole period of 10 years, but the preventive detention component of the sentence meant that Katipa wouldn't be released until proving that he's no longer a threat to society.
He used his sentence, I guess, the preventive detention, and I guess what you're suggesting is that he was going to be in jail for a very long time, to threaten his cellmates. What was he saying, basically, that he had nothing to lose, was he?
That's right, and that's known inside as being a lifer. So if he had offended and been caught inside prison, the other prisoners knew nothing would be added to a sentence. You can't serve longer than life, obviously. And that's relevant. The Crown said he held that over his victims. He used threats of violence against them. One of them he actually knocked unconscious before raping him. One of the men was repeatedly raped for a week, and another was so scared of reprisals that he only spoke to the police once Katipa had been moved off his wing. The 3 victims, they weren't strangers to prison life, but as they gave their evidence, the effects of what had happened to them were evident to all in the courtroom. And one of the men spoke about having a target on his back after making this complaint. They were worried about being branded as snitches.
Gosh, this is shattering evidence you've been listening to, Eddie. Katipa, of course, said it was all made up, didn't he?
That's right. His defence was the complainants had lengthy criminal records. Some had a history of dishonesty offending. It also emerged during the trial that one of the complainants was suing corrections for what had happened. Katipa's lawyers said that showed they had motivation to lie. But after this lengthy jury deliberation over 3 days, 14 hours, I added up, Katipa was found guilty, all 14 charges, guilty verdicts on all 14 charges.
So they were going through charge by charge, the jury, right? Yeah.
And he'll be sentenced in November. And this afternoon we heard from the Crown prosecutor, Natalie Walker, in court. She indicated that the Crown will be seeking a further sentence of preventive detention. Just how that works on top of a current sentence of preventive detention.
I guess the key point for everyone involved is that he has to be kept away from other people in prison, right?
And I guess that will go to the parole board, I guess, if or when they make that decision.
Edward Gay was at the High Court in Auckland. Let's head south. A worker at the Springs Junction garage says they're gearing up to feed a line of truck drivers stranded in the South Island township by snow. The transport agency says the alternate route between Picton and Christchurch will remain closed overnight for safety reasons, with snow having closed the Lewis Park. Lewis Pass. Stephen Baker told our reporter Tracy Neal there's a line of more than 25 trucks extending down the road outside the garage, with drivers now getting ready to spend the night in their vehicles.
Yeah, we've got quite a few here at the moment, yes.
How many do you reckon are lined up there?
I'll go out the door and have a quick look. Yeah, I'd say probably at the moment in the vicinity of about 25. Yeah, but there's some of them also lined up down the road which we can't see either. A lot of them are, they'll take their breaks and everything like that. A lot of them have got their own sleeping arrangements in their cabs, so they'll sleep in there, and we'll just feed them. And
how do they stay warm?
With these trucks these days, they've got they're hooked up with electric blankets and all that type of stuff. So the refrigerated ones will have to keep running to keep everything refrigerated, but other than that, no, they're pretty well catered for these days.
So, okay, so you say in the garage you feed them. Is that another service the garage provides? Or?
We do pies and sandwiches and cakes and all that type of stuff, and coffee, but we also have got a food cart here as well. It does burgers and wraps and fish and chips and all that type of thing as well.
Stephen Baker of the Springs Junction Garage. The Transport Agency says the decision to close a major highway is not made lightly, but is done to protect road users. 25 trucks lined up there, the drivers getting ready to spend the night in their vehicles, as you heard. A huge iceberg of misinformation. That's how the Burmese leader Aung San Suu Kyi is describing multiple media reports regarding her military crackdowns against the Rohingya Muslims in the Rakhine state. Around 150,000 Rohingya have fled across the Bangladesh border in the past fortnight, bringing with them horrific tales of violence at the hands of the military. Up to 400 Rohingya have been killed, and hundreds of villages in the north have been razed to the ground. The army and the Myanmar government say they were burned by the Rohingya themselves, and reports of army abuses are just wrong and a manipulation of the Western media. The BBC's Caroline Hawley reports.
The exodus seems to be accelerating. Terrified Rohingyas are fleeing from Myanmar however they can. Several children are said to have drowned today trying to escape to Bangladesh.
They burned our houses. We couldn't take our belongings. We were hiding near a hill for 2 days. We were there in the rain without food and with my children. When we heard the sound of shooting, we took a boat and crossed the sea to come here to Bangladesh.
The refugees bring with them new reports of atrocities that have drawn international condemnation. The world had hoped the country's de facto leader would use her moral authority to speak out. Aung San Suu Kyi won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1991 for her non-violent struggle for democracy and human rights, accepting it in 2012. She'd spent 15 years under house arrest during the country's military rule, but today at a press conference with the Indian Prime Minister, Aung San Suu Kyi was conspicuously silent on the victims of Myanmar's military crackdown. She said misinformation was distorting reality, and she blamed terrorists for the crisis.
We believe that together we can work to make sure that terrorism is not allowed to take root on our soil or on the soil of our neighbouring countries.
So, who are the Rohingya? They're Muslims who face discrimination and persecution for decades in mainly Buddhist Myanmar, which considers them illegal immigrants from Bangladesh. But Bangladesh denies that they're its citizens. Many were forced from their villages by communal violence in Rakhine State in 2012. The latest refugee crisis has been caused by what the military is calling clearance operations, following attacks by Rohingya militants on police positions. 150,000 Rohingyas have fled Myanmar in the last 2 weeks alone. More than 230,000 have escaped to Bangladesh since last October. Malala Yousafzai, a fellow recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, this week called on Aung San Suu Kyi to condemn what she called the tragic and shameful treatment of the Rohingyas. Aid agencies haven't been allowed into the areas they're fleeing from, and the UN Secretary-General has warned that this crisis could spiral into a humanitarian catastrophe.
The BBC's Caroline Hawley, exactly 11 minutes to 6. Yesterday, RNZ told the story of a man who's been living with his family in a South Auckland boarding house for 7 years. Raymond Tainaki, his wife and 2 sons live in one room at Favona Lodge in Mangere because they can't afford market rents and gave up waiting for a state house. Now, after the story aired, the government rang Mr Tainaki to try and put him back on the social housing register. This is Eva Corlett's story. She updates it.
Raymond Tainaki says he thought it was a joke when the ministry phoned to put him back on the social housing register.
They said they want to reinstate me and my family onto the waiting list. They asked me, why did I get off? And I said, well, I lost trust in them. You know, they weren't doing anything. We were on the list for a very, very long time.
Mr Tainaki, who cannot work due to sickness, had removed his family from the social housing register after waiting 5 years for a house.
When our first son was born, he was born premature. So we had all the letters from the specialists in Middlemore Hospital, and when we told them that story, they said, okay, you guys are going on top of the list. And we waited and waited, nothing happened. And then our next son was born, same situation. So we ended up in private rent, moving here, and then they sold the house and we moved again. So we got frustrated and that's how we ended up here.
Mr Tainaki, his wife and sons, aged 13 and 11, live in one room at the lodge and share facilities with the other tenants. During the phone call, he said the ministry advised him to check private rentals and their prices. But with the family living off his wife's income as a carer, he says paying market rent is out of the question.
For example, for $450 rent, it's going to cost us $900 a fortnight. My wife gets paid fortnightly, $999 a fortnight she gets. What are we going to do with the other 99? We got to pay the power, we got to pay the water rate, we got to pay the gas or whatever it is. And our children, one of our boys is going to De La Salle next year, and our daughter is in Macaulay. Bro, how are we going to pay all that?
He wants the government to understand the problems families like his face.
We don't have that freedom, everybody in one room. It's just not right. I mean, it's just like putting a car in a garage or two cars in a garage and that's it. But we are human. We all have a soul. We want to be happy.
Mr Tainaki will have a phone meeting with the ministry early next week. An emergency housing provider says homelessness has peaked over the last 18 months, with desperate, vulnerable people waiting longer and longer for a house. Bernie Smith of Monte Cecilia Trust says many give up.
English being a second language, there's stigmatisation of people that are living in poverty or low socioeconomic. Then there's the whole issue of going into a WIN's office and waiting hours and hours in reception to get an appointment. So there's a lot of frustration from people who have genuine need that give up.
He says it's frustrating that the ministry seems to only get in touch with families after media exposure.
Suddenly the bureaucrats come out of the woodwork and want to shut it down pretty quick, and there's all sorts of offers that were never available before. While it's a huge advantage to this family, what about everyone else in the same situation? Do they have to get a headline in the newspaper as well?
The Ministry of Social Development says everyone going through a housing assessment must check if there's an affordable private rental option first. It says, depending on the circumstances, the housing package could include a house or an accommodation supplement. I tamaki makaurau mo te hōtaka o te ahiahi, ko Eva Corlett, tēnei.
Coming up to 7 minutes to 6, Christchurch locals are about to get new shopping and dining choices in what was a desolate earthquake-damaged central business district. Several major stores in a multi-million-dollar shopping complex known as The Crossing will this week throw open their doors, along with the first of a collection of new bars and restaurants along the Avon River. Logan Church went to have a look.
Central Christchurch is bustling. Almost 7 years since 2 earthquakes devastated the city, a number of broken city blocks have been reborn into modern shopping and dining destinations. And locals are stoked.
It's been really cool to see it develop and sort of grow and get more stores. And like seeing all the new ones that are like so close to opening is really exciting.
I've been down here for 4 or 5 days, and the improvements, even around this particular precinct, have been amazing.
It's quite exciting to see a lot of people around and the new places opening, and obviously it gives the people working around here more opportunities to go out and then experience during lunchtime and after work.
The Crossing, a $140 million shopping centre, includes retail giant H&M and clothing brands Country Road, Trinity and Witchery. The developer, Philip Carter, says it's the biggest project he's tackled.
We committed the whole development and started without any tenants.
and it's taken a lot of legwork to get good tenants.
It's a bit of a gamble.
I had faith in Christchurch. We really felt that this was such a key development and a key part of the city that tenants would come.
Christchurch residents are already wandering around the nearly completed centre as shop owners rush to complete fit-outs, builders make last-minute adjustments and workers clean their store windows. Philip Casa hopes his developments will help attract people back into the city centre.
I think it's a combination of lots of people putting money back in the city. We have the logo, the city starts here, and I believe the city kind of is, the retail part of the city at least is pivoted around here.
Down the road, along the banks of the Avon River, a line of bars and restaurants are also making last-minute preparations. Fat Eddie's, a pre-quake jazz bar, is making a comeback, as well as 2 new adjacent restaurants and bars. As the jazz band goes through a technical rehearsal, the general manager, Stuart Black, tells me that last 2 weeks have been frantic.
Just getting little things refined, whether it's decor, plumbing, electricity, issues with the AC units, lighting, whatever it is. Usually everything needs to be fine-tuned, so everything's 99% there, and that 1% usually cannot be done until the very last seconds. So that's why it's pretty hectic.
Having worked in hospitality in New York, Stuart hopes this is the turning point for Christchurch.
Everyone has a part to play. There are a lot of other venues that are opening up nearby, hopefully within the end of the year, if not the beginning of the year. And I think everyone takes for granted how important hospitality is in not only revitalising, but creating or making a city boom.
Fat Eddie's is opening tomorrow night, with H&M and other clothing stores planning their own openings over the coming days. In Christchurch for Checkpoint, Logan Church.
Nice, Logan. It's been a heavy few weeks on Checkpoint. Lots of grim news. We're going to cheer you up now and in some cases actually thoroughly revolt you if you're watching. From the longest fingernails to the oldest bodybuilder and a cat with the longest tail. This is the big one, ladies and gentlemen. Don't change the dial. The Guinness World Records 2018 book has been released today, and the 63rd edition, I remember them from my childhood, is packed with record-breaking, bizarre accomplishments from animals and individuals from around the world. Some of the stuff is revolting, really, but if you're watching, you're in for a treat. Let's begin with daredevil Biff Hutchinson. Yes, Biff, who holds the world record for the highest jump on a pogo stick. I know some of you have been going for this. 3.3 metres is the mark. He also holds the world record for the most injuries.
I've broken both my ankles 2 or 3 times, my right leg in about 5 places, dislocated kneecap, broken collarbone, dislocated shoulder, broke both my wrists, a bunch of my fingers, broke my jaw, and I've had 13, 14, 15 concussions.
Go Biff. The world's longest nails belong to Texas nail artist Ayana Williams. She's been growing her nails for 23 years, so now collectively almost 11 metres long. If you're watching, here she is painting them. If you're not watching, consider yourself blessed. Binny the Bunny is the smartest rabbit in the world. Why? Well, he holds the record for the most slam dunks, that's a basketball term, by a rabbit in 1 minute. Go Binny.
And I'm thrilled to announce that with 7 slam dunks, Binny has successfully set the Guinness World Records title. Congratulations.
Oh. Congratulations. I'm not sure that Binny would have understood that. If you thought that was good, though, Binny is also a good painter and enjoys reading. Whew. Jim Arrington has won the title of the oldest professional bodybuilder. Jim is 85 years old. He's been going to the gym 3 times a week since he was 15. He's actually in magnificent nick. Benny Harlem's hairdo is on another level. The Los Angeles resident has the title for the tallest high top fade. If you imagine, say, shoving a fork in a wall socket, that's what your hair would look like. It took him 2 hours to get a record-breaking height of 52 centimetres. And last but not least, if you're in a tight space, you'll want Alistair Moffat to park your car. This is quite extraordinary. You really are missing if you're not watching this, unlike the nails before. He holds the title for the tightest parallel parking in reverse. If you're only listening, that's the sound of Alistair spinning into a parking space in his Mini with only 34 cm to spare. It really is quite something, unlike the fingernails. Yeah, the fingernails were truly disgusting. I want to apologise to anyone who's offended by those images. It's coming up to 6 o'clock. We understand a quite major coal mine Brunton poll is coming up at 6. We will have the latest on that live after the news with Katrina. Joan Isaac from Kandala has emailed us. Dear Checkpoint, who in the prison system is going to be held responsible for the extraordinary decision to double bunk a convicted rapist with another prisoner? Why would they do that? From memory, one was a very young man. Someone should be held responsible for such a massive error of judgment. And Joan, whilst we don't express opinions or even hold opinions on RNZ, if I did, I would agree with you unequivocally. It seems an extraordinary state of affairs. He was on preventative detention for rape and he was double bunking with younger cellmates.
RNZ News at 6. Maloelele, good evening. Ko Katrina Batten tēnei. 2 small Caribbean islands have been flattened by the ferocious winds of Hurricane Irma, which is leaving a trail of devastation across the region. At least 6 people have been killed by Irma, which is now passing north of Puerto Rico, from where the BBC's Laura Bicker reports.
The worst of Hurricane Irma has passed Puerto Rico and the damage is still being assessed. Emergency crews are trying to get in touch with remote areas of the island. Many of the 3.5 million people here are without power, including 22 hospitals. And the electricity company is warning that it could be 4 months before supplies are restored. There is a sense of relief that Puerto Rico was spared the devastation seen on the island of Barbuda in the Eastern Caribbean, where houses, schools, government offices and the island's only hospital took the full force of the wind.
Laura Bicker reporting. It can now be revealed that the prisoner who raped 3 of his cellmates was serving a sentence of preventive detention for rape at the time. William Katipa was today found guilty of 14 charges, including sexual violation and threatening to kill, following a trial in the High Court in Auckland. RNZ News court reporter Edward Gay told Checkpoint tonight that while the jurors knew Katipa was serving preventive detention, they didn't know what for. In fact, he had raped a young woman in the 1990s and a 13-year-old girl 8 years later. He was sentenced in 2005 to preventive detention with a minimum non-parole period of 10 years. Despite being a convicted rapist, Katipa was double bunked with other prisoners, 3 of whom he raped. He'll be sentenced in November. An iwi-run school in Gisborne and a science-focused school in Auckland are among 4 new charter schools announced today. The Education Under-Secretary, David Seymour, says they'll open in 2019. Our education correspondent, John Gerritsen, reports. We'll come back to that story. The Chief Executive of New Zealand Rugby, Steve Tew, says the sense of entitlement felt by some young rugby players is unwarranted and needs to change. A review released today reveals 36 cases of rugby player misconduct have been investigated over the past 4 years, including inappropriate sexual behaviour, homophobic slurs and drug and alcohol offences. The review was commissioned by New Zealand Rugby after an incident last year in which a stripper was abused and manhandled at an end-of-season party for the Chiefs team. Mr Tew says the report has highlighted several issues they can now work towards changing.
We're seeing our young boys in particular playing first 15 rugby effectively being told that they're elite high-performance athletes at a ridiculously young age, frankly, and therefore developing, I think, under the pressure of that expectation, a sense of entitlement and some of the issues that stardom brings with it without yet being emotionally and mentally ready for it.
Steve Tew of New Zealand Rugby. Back to our earlier story about an iwi-run school in Gisborne and a science-focused school in Auckland are among 4 new charter schools announced today. Here's our education reporter, John Gerritsen.
All 4 are secondary schools. They include a Christchurch outpost of Auckland's Vanguard Military School and a Maori bilingual secondary school to go with the primary school the Manukau Urban Māori Authority runs in South Auckland. There will also be an iwi-run junior high school for children in years 9 to 11 in Gisborne and an inner-city Auckland school with a focus on science, technology, engineering, arts and maths. The 4 schools add to the 10 existing partnership schools and 2 others that are scheduled to open next year. Ko John Gerritsen tēnei.
In an effort to encourage more people into Christchurch's CBD, the City Council is offering an hour's free parking in all its parking buildings. Residents and businesses have been crying foul over the removal of a large number of on-street parks as the city is transformed into a more pedestrian and cycle-friendly environment. Today, the council agreed to trial 1 hour free parking. The 4-month trial will begin once the council opens its new 800 park Litchfield Street building at the end of next month. It hopes the trial will put pressure on privately owned car parking buildings to bring down their prices. A worker at the Springs Junction garage says it's gearing up to feed a line of truck drivers stranded in the South Island township by snow. The transport agency says the alternative route between Picton and Christchurch will remain closed overnight for safety reasons, with snow having closed the Lewis Pass. Stephen Baker says a line of more than 25 trucks extends down the road outside the garage, with drivers now getting ready to spend the night in their vehicles.
A lot of them have got their own sleeping arrangements in their cabs, so they'll sleep in there and we'll just feed them. And with these trucks these days, they've got, they're hooked up with electric blankets and all that type of stuff.
Stephen Baker, the transport agency, says closing a major highway is not done lightly, but road users' protection is paramount. It's 6:05. To sport, and Roger Federer's hopes of winning a 20th Grand Slam title are over. He's been beaten in 4 sets by Juan Martín del Potro in the quarter-finals of the US Tennis Open. The Argentinian, who beat Federer in the 2009 final at Flushing Meadows, now faces world number 1 Rafa Nadal in the semis. It's the only major tournament in which the long-time rivals have never played each other. Del Potro says he felt on top of his game today.
I did everything well. I served so good. I hit my forehand as harder as I can. And I think we played a great match and I deserve to win in the end.
Juan Martín del Potro. The Argentina coach Daniel Orcard has swung the axe in an effort to resurrect his side's rugby championship campaign. He's made 7 changes to his starting lineup for the test against the All Blacks in New Plymouth on Saturday. The Pumas lost their opening 2 games to the Springboks and have won just 5 of their 18 tests since the 2015 World Cup. They've never beaten the All Blacks. The English goalkeeper at the centre of the so-called Piegate controversy earlier this year has been fined $680 and banned for 2 months for breaching FA betting rules. Sutton United's Wayne Shaw, dubbed the roly-poly goalie, ate a pasty during February's FA Cup loss to Arsenal after a bookmaker offered odds of $9 that he'd eat a pie during the match. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, our changing world checks out plants so rare, scientists know each specimen on a first name basis. We've got a window on the world of fermentation, and this week's cultural ambassador Miles Buckingham has mostly Jamaican music recorded by the wonderfully eclectic label On New Sound. On Nights, everything including the kitchen sink, with me, Brian Crump, after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Met service weather through to midnight. Tomorrow, Northland, Auckland, Coromandel and Bay of Plenty. Occasional showers, some heavy. Western areas from Waikato to Kapiti, including the central high country. Periods of rain or showers with a few squally thunderstorms in the west today. Gisborne, Hawke's Bay, Wairarapa, Wellington, Marlborough and Nelson. Rain about the ranges and a few showers elsewhere. Westerly gales in exposed parts of Hawke's Bay and Wairarapa. Bulla, Westland, Fiordland, also Canterbury High Country. Periods of rain, sometimes heavy with thunderstorms and hail. Snow down to 500 metres at times, but lowering to 200 metres in Fiordland tomorrow night. For the remainder of Canterbury, also Otago and Southland. Scattered showers, mainly about Otago and Southland, but a few spreading to Canterbury at times. Possible thunderstorms in the east today. And the Chatham Islands, rain easing to showers this evening. Thunderstorms possible tomorrow morning. It is 6:08 and you're listening to Checkpoint.
Thank you very much indeed, Katrina Batten. Let's go to the Colmar-Brunton poll. Our colleagues at TVNZ have just released this. Labor's steady at 43%, which it was on the last poll a week ago. Remember, they were about 24% just prior to Jacinda Ardern becoming leader. But National is down 2% to 39%. That is their lowest level since 2005, down 2 to 39. It's the first time they've been sub 40 since 2005. New Zealand First is up 1% at 9%. The Green Party is steady at 5%. Remember, that's the MMP threshold. The Maori Party on top both sit at 2%. And the ACT Party is steady at 0.1%. Labour leader, 0.1%. Labour leader Jacinda Ardern is up 1% to 35% as preferred Prime Minister. And National leader Bill English is down 2 to 31%. Joining us now is political commentator Chris Trotter. Chris, are you there?
I am, John.
No, nice to talk to you again. I like elections. You get to catch up with everyone. How are you going, Chris?
Going very well, thank you, John.
Yeah, and so too are the Labour Party by the look of this. So I'm just going to reiterate, they're at 43, which is steady, a week on from the last Colmar Brunton. The Nat's down 2 to 39. That is their lowest level since 2005, which is in fact the last time they lost an election, right? What do you make of all of this, Chris?
Well, I think Jacinda Ardern will be extremely pleased to see that she's holding at what is a very high level of Labour support, it has to be said, because I don't think Helen Clark was able to push her numbers up to 43% at any time during her Prime Ministership. So this is a very, very good result for Labour, and very worrying, I imagine, for the government, because the Colmar Brunton poll tends to overstate national support slightly. At least that's been the historical experience, sometimes by as much as 3 or 4%. So if they're at 39 in a Colmar Brunton poll, I imagine they'll be very concerned indeed.
Chris, I think that you have every right to say, I told you so, because one of the first people to come out and say Jacinda Ardern can take Labour north of 40 was you, wasn't it?
Oh, I honestly don't know whether I was the first, second, third, fourth or 23rd.
You were near the front of the queue. Why? What's happening here?
Well, I sensed that the moment she took over the leadership, we were dealing with somebody quite different, certainly very different from the 4 rather grey men who had preceded her. From the very first press conference she gave, just minutes after taking over the leadership of the Labour Party, it was clear to me that we were dealing with a political rock star, and certainly you could see it in the faces of the press gallery that it was very much. I'm minded, and I guess you're about the same vintage as me, more or less, John. But remember that famous ad for a soft drink where the actors go, "Oh, it's good." Yeah. I think there was very much, not only in the press gallery but across the whole country, there was that, "Oh, she's good," and it was such a relief, I think, for people who were sort of in Labour's camp or the Greens' camp, or they'd gone backwards and forwards between the two over the years, but had really almost reached a point of utter despair after 4 Labour leaders, and suddenly they dared hope again.
I was fascinated to see the National Party response to her at first, which was the sense of her inexperience, her youth, a vague kind of inference of dilettantism or something. And I remember back to when John Key just swept all before him for the Nats. And I remember Labour saying again and again and again, he is insubstantial and that bubble will burst. And it seems to me to have a similar quality of the incumbent party underestimating someone who's come from somewhat out of the blue.
Yes, well, it's one of those delicious historical ironies, isn't it? That exactly the same experience that Labour underwent as part of the key phenomenon is now being endured by the National Party, and it's been a while between drinks. I mean, the National Party's had a damn good inning.
Yeah, they've been at the well. They've been at the well drinking mightily, haven't they?
Nine long years, from my perspective. In any case, but Labour simply couldn't connect with people. It tried 4 times to find a person who could make that connection with the electorate that certainly Helen Clark had, at least in her first couple of terms. And they weren't finding the right people, and they weren't, connecting with the electorate. And then suddenly, this young woman steps forward and seems to have it all. And it really did strike me as a case of someone who played her hand with supreme skill. One of the things you really don't want to do in the Labour Party is signal too clearly that you're leadership material, because you paint an extremely large target on your back if you do. And she won over her party, and she won over large chunks of the population, but in a way which was, in a sense, apolitical. She was in the women's magazines. She sort of appeared in front of large crowds as a sort of guest DJ. People felt they knew her, but her colleagues, I don't think, rated her as a serious threat, and that was their big mistake.
Chris Trotter, political commentator, thank you so much for joining us. So, Labour 43, the net's down to at 39, but still over 2 weeks till the election. Hurricane Irma has killed at least 7 and left widespread destruction in the Caribbean. The small island of Barbuda is said to be barely habitable after Irma wiped out 90% of buildings, and there are warnings of similar devastation in all the territories that Irma is passing over. After Harvey and Katrina, all the hurricanes that have dominated communities, destroyed communities and dominated global media, you can be forgiven for asking what makes Irma different. Well, it's big, but that's not it. It's where it began, much further out at sea than hurricanes usually come from, and over deeper ocean. To quote NASA, tropical cyclones are like giant engines that use warm, moist air as fuel. That's why they only form over warm ocean waters near the equators. But as the temperature rises, hurricane territory may be expanding. It's too early to say for sure, but Eric Fisher, chief meteorologist for CBS based in Boston, says Irma certainly is unusual.
Well, John, what makes this storm very unique is how strong it became so far out into the ocean. When you think about the Atlantic basin, to get your strongest storms, you need extremely warm water. That's the fuel for a hurricane, right? And the Caribbean and also into the Gulf of Mexico, those tend to be your warm water spots. That's where we have our records for strongest hurricanes. Well, Irma got up to 185 miles per hour east of the Leeward Islands, and that has never been recorded before. So it reached an intensity we hadn't seen in a location very far off toward the east, and it's maintained it, and it's expected to maintain that over the next several days.
And so 185 miles, we do Ks in New Zealand, so it's well over 300. So that is just ferocious, isn't it?
I know here in the United States, we're a little backwards with our imperial system. Everyone else does not follow, but yes, it is a ferocious storm, and we're getting some of those first images from the islands it hit directly in the British Virgin Islands, U.S. Virgin Islands, also Barbuda, and the northern leewards, and it looks extremely just horrible and sad to see, just wiped clean in some of those areas.
It's absolutely heartbreaking, the damage it's doing. And this is not a geopolitical interview. You're a meteorologist, but a lot of these communities don't have much money for rebuilding, do they? Puerto Rico, for example, has a debt crisis, and so the infrastructural damage will be hard for them to recover from.
That's absolutely true. Certain islands more well off than others, and some of them do build better than others. If you look at some of the construction, that's a big factor in the impact of some of these storms. Some islands you'll see all concrete, built to withstand stronger storms, whereas in the United States you might not see that.
Eric, it's too early to say I know about where exactly Irma will go in terms of Florida, but when you look at the Keys, this archipelago, which is low-lying, linked by a road that is essentially, it's explicitly at sea level. It's actually at sea level. What sort of damage will happen there if Irma goes directly through the Keys and that area?
Well, I would think that this is the greatest threat to South Florida since Hurricane Andrew, and that was back in '92, and that was a much smaller, more compact hurricane. This will be a larger hurricane, and we've also seen a tremendous amount of development. That's a big story that as meteorologists we have been talking about for a while now. They haven't had a major hurricane in South Florida since Andrew, at least in the Miami area, and so you've added many, many people, many more buildings. It's just more harm. More in harm's way, I should say. So if you bring in a storm surge that's over 15, say 20 feet, places like the Keys, sea level areas, around Biscayne Bay that surrounds Miami, you are talking about a very catastrophic situation, especially with those strong winds on top of it.
And in the quarter of a century since Andrew, you talk about development, a lot of building, a lot of homes going in. Have meteorologists and people who understand these things been warning of the risk?
So absolutely. I think this has been one of the biggest stories over the last several years because we've had a bit of a hurricane drought, if you will, in the United States. We haven't had a major hurricane make landfall until Harvey, that we just had a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
But before then, it was 2005. So a lot of people in that time got a little complacent, and we were looking at places like Houston and like Miami, and lo and behold, back-to-back storms striking two of the most vulnerable areas in the United States. We think this will come very close to Miami, and it's a place that with some sea level rise already floods just when there's a full or a new moon phase, even without a storm. So you bring in a hurricane, and you could talk about some serious inundation.
It's Eric Fisher, CBS's chief meteorologist. As Eric was saying, Florida presents unique issues. It's very coastal, very low-lying, and the Florida Keys, which stretch out into the ocean, a dotted archipelago connected by a single low road, are currently in Irma's projected path. Our correspondent Steve Mort is there, and he told us Irma is forecast to hit in the next 72 hours, and people are getting out.
The major problem with that is that the Miami area has a population of some 6 million people, sort of very much like the population of the greater Houston area that, of course, we saw devastated by the floodwaters from Hurricane Harvey. The slight difference here is that Miami actually sits much closer to the coastline than Houston, right along the coast. In fact, there is no section of the Miami area that isn't more than about 30 kilometers wide, but it does stretch for about 150 kilometers or so north to south. So a very large, very densely populated corridor of people. And it's extremely low-lying, and that is the major concern for a lot of folks here, because this area does tend to flood even during regular afternoon storms during the summertime because it's so low-lying. And when you have the amount of rain that is expected to come from this storm pouring in through both rainfall and storm surge, then really you have a major flood risk, whether or not the eye of the hurricane makes landfall in Miami or not. So that is one of the key concerns that we're seeing here this time around, whether or not the hurricane is going to make landfall and the rain making that it's going to do. Preparations are in full swing here, of course. The state of emergency is in effect for the entire state. The Governor, Rick Scott, telling people in Miami to make their way to higher ground. There is a mandatory evacuation order in place for the Florida Keys. That's a low-lying chain of islands that stretches out into the Caribbean Sea to the south of Miami. Long queues of traffic trying to get off those islands. Around where I am here in Orlando, we're expecting a lot of rain as well, and I was just driving around a couple of the petrol stations here. Many of those petrol stations are now completely out of fuel. People are buying up supplies while they can. Long lines at the grocery stores in this area. People buying up as much water as they can. Oftentimes water supplies can be cut when there is major damage to infrastructure in the wake of these storms. And I'll tell you, a lot of people that I've spoken to are taking no chances because of what they've seen in recent days in Houston. Florida's no stranger to major hurricanes, but one of this strength hasn't really hit this state in recent years. Anything basically equivalent was back in 1992 when Hurricane Andrew devastated sections of Miami. The Florida Governor, Rick Scott, saying that this storm, this time around, could be worse than Andrew. It might not be, but it could. And people seem to be, at this instance, taking that advice to heart and really getting the supplies and getting prepared when they can.
Steve Mort in Florida. New Zealand Rugby has investigated 36 cases of misconduct in the past 4 years, including inappropriate sexual behaviour, violence and drug and alcohol offences. The figure's been revealed in the Respect and Responsibility Review commissioned by New Zealand Rugby after a stripper was abused, manhandled and had gravel thrown at her at a boozy end-of-season party for the Chiefs rugby team. The panel has recommended several goals to improve rugby culture, but says rugby is also doing a lot right. Rowan Quinn reports.
The report says the Chiefs incident and other off-field scandals threaten to undermine the high esteem in which rugby's held in New Zealand and the contribution it makes. Most of the 36 cases of serious misconduct involve players, all professional, and 4 were repeat offenders. More than half of the incidents involved alcohol, with drugs also a factor. The review panel's chair, Law Society head Catherine Beck, says there were 250 responses to a request from the public for their feelings on rugby's culture. She says about half were positive and the rest disappointing.
The impact and use of alcohol, the behaviour towards women, the stardom and sense of entitlement that you see in some of the younger players, those were all themes that we saw that did come through quite strongly.
The report contains examples of the feedback received, including sexual assaults at a club room being minimised or hushed up, women being referred to disrespectfully in court sessions, or men referring to women visiting the club as sluts. Catherine Beck sees involving more women in the game as integral to improving that culture.
Both respect for women on and off the field, and creating and bringing women into all levels of rugby and in all roles.
She says despite many negative stories, she was surprised at the number of positive experiences people had and the signals that old attitudes were often being challenged. She says New Zealand rugby's already changing, but more needs to be done. The report says it must become more inclusive of people of all races, sexualities and disabilities, and must do more to make players more well-rounded. Ms Beck says that should start at school level before attitudes are entrenched. The union's chief executive, Steve Chu, says the list of 36 goals set by the review will be challenging, but New Zealand Rugby is committed to them. He says the Chiefs scandal and others have been damaging, and a lack of change could have financial impacts.
There's no doubt that that has an impact on the view people have of our sport and of our teams and of our brands. There's no doubt about that. To date, our partners have been supportive, but there's no question that they don't want to see the same things going on and on and on without some action.
Mr Chu says he's had a change of heart during the review process, initially thinking that rugby's problems were just a reflection of society's.
Yes, New Zealand still has some big problems, because we do. We have child obesity, we have sexual violence, we have domestic violence, we have young kids getting killed. We've got all sorts of problems in this country which we don't like and we shouldn't have. But if rugby can do a little bit more to change some of the attitudes and behaviour of people, then that will be inspiring and unifying, and I will be very happy with our contribution to that.
The review panel also says it wants New Zealand Rugby to set up systems that means it must be accountable and implement all the changes. Mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi, ko Rowan Quinn tēnei.
Doctors are now able to prescribe medicinal cannabis without approval from the Ministry of Health, but advocates say the move is purely symbolic and won't make a difference to people in pain. The law change lifts the restrictions so doctors can import and prescribe cannabidiol, which was previously a controlled drug under the Misuse of Drugs Act, bringing New Zealand to line with other countries, including Australia. Emma Hatton has more.
Rose Renton has been lobbying for medicinal cannabis since her 19-year-old son Alex died of severe epilepsy in 2015. He was the first New Zealander to be granted an exemption to use it by the government. Since then, the law has been changed, and from today, doctors are able to prescribe it. But Miss Renton says it doesn't go far enough. She says saying restrictions have been lifted is cruel and sends a false message that medicinal cannabis is more widely available than before.
It's a bit like dangling a carrot in front of a child's face and saying, if you're hungry, here it is, but you can't have it. The only CBD that the New Zealand government will allow to bring in is overseas products that are hugely priced. So the New Zealand public are being told one thing, but they're actually not being given any affordable access to it.
A Nelson lawyer and medicinal cannabis advocate Sue Gray agrees it is unlikely patients will see any real change when it comes to accessing cannabidiol products.
In theory, they're allowed now in New Zealand. In practice, it's still really unclear what products are actually going to get into New Zealand because of all the importing restrictions.
She says the law change is mostly symbolic.
Symbolically, it's hugely important because it's the government recognising that there are benefits to cannabinoids, whereas in the past they've always said, we need more research and we don't know. So symbolically, it's great.
Despite this, Rose Renton welcomed the law change, saying it will at least encourage more people to discuss medicinal cannabis as an option.
For all those people that go, oh, I'd love to try it, but I don't want to break the law. And there are so many of those people out there. And so it gives them a emotional feeling that they're not going to get in trouble for choosing it as a medicine.
Otago University fifth-year medical student Victoria Catherwood says now doctors need to be better educated about what is on offer and what they can talk to their patients about.
1 in 20 patients over the age of 15 do use medicinal cannabis. So a lot of doctors, GPs, they do get patients coming in and asking a lot of questions, but unfortunately doctors and medical students are only educated about cannabis misuse and abuse. There's no education around the medicinal side.
Ms Catherwood says doctors have an obligation to their patients under the Health and Disabilities Act to have informed discussions about medicinal cannabis so they are able to make informed decisions. For Checkpoint, Emma Hatton.
And that story from Emma ends Checkpoint for tonight. Thank you for being with us. We really appreciate your company and we hope you join us again when we are back on air tomorrow night from 5. Until then, ka kite anō and a very good evening indeed.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. Labour remains in the lead in the latest political poll. TVNZ's Colmar Brunton poll has Labour steady on 43% and National down 2 on 39%. Jacinda Ardern is up 1% to 35% as preferred Prime Minister and Bill English is down 2 to 31%. New Zealand First is up 1% at 9%, while the Green Party is steady at 5%. The Maori Party and Top are both on 2, while ACT is on 0.1%. 2 small Caribbean islands have been flattened by the ferocious winds of Hurricane Irma. The prisoner who raped 3 of his cellmates was serving a sentence of preventive detention for 2 rapes at the time. And drivers stranded as snow keeps the Lewis Pass closed. Our next news and weather at 7.
This week on Music 101, we get serious. The leaders of each political party tell us their favourite song and band.